The Detroit City Courthouse stood tall and imposing against the gray October sky of 2023. Its marble columns and wide steps had witnessed countless stories of justice and injustice over the years, but none quite like what was about to unfold in Courtroom 304. Judge Karen Wilson arrived early that morning, just as she had done every day for the past 10 years. The security guards greeted her with warm smiles as she passed through the metal detectors, her black robe draped neatly over her arm. At 52 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every step of her success. "Good morning, Your Honor," called out Jerry, the elderly security guard who had been working at the courthouse since before she became a judge. "Looks like you got a full docket today." Judge Wilson smiled and nodded, her mind already reviewing the cases she would hear. She had worked her way up from a public defender's office in one of Detroit's toughest neighborhoods to become one of the most respected circuit court judges in the city. The journey hadn't been easy. As one of only 3 African-American female judges in the district, she had faced her share of challenges and prejudices. Inside her chambers, Judge Wilson arranged her desk with the precision that had become her trademark. Her law degree from Harvard hung on the wall beside family photos, her late parents at her graduation, her younger sister's wedding, and her teenage son's recent basketball tournament victory. Each image reminded her of why she had chosen this path. Sarah Martinez, her court clerk for the past 5 years, knocked and entered with the day's files. "Judge Wilson, I wanted to give you a heads up about the 10 a.m. case," she said, placing a thick folder on the desk. "It's a traffic violation, but something feels off about it." Judge Wilson opened the file and began reading. The case seemed straightforward enough. A young black college student named Marcus Thompson had been ticketed for running a red light. He was contesting the citation, claiming he had been targeted unfairly. The arresting officer, James Harrison, was scheduled to testify. As she read through Officer Harrison's report, something caught her attention. The language used was unusually aggressive for a simple traffic stop. She pulled up Harrison's record on her computer and noticed a pattern: multiple complaints about racial profiling and excessive force, all dismissed or buried in bureaucratic paperwork. "Sarah, can you pull the statistics on Officer Harrison's traffic stops for the past year?" Judge Wilson asked, her judicial instincts kicking in. 20 minutes later, Sarah returned with the data. The numbers told a clear story. Harrison had pulled over black drivers at a rate 4 times higher than any other demographic. Judge Wilson made a few notes in the margin of her file. She believed in justice being truly blind, but she also knew that sometimes you had to open your eyes wide to ensure it. At 9:45 a.m., she took a moment to center herself, as she did before every session. The weight of her position was never lost on her. Her father, a factory worker who had marched with Dr. King, had always told her, "Baby, when you get to the top, make sure you send the elevator back down for others." She lived by those words. The courthouse was filling up now. Through her chamber doors, she could hear the familiar buzz of attorneys conferring with clients, the shuffle of papers, and the quiet murmur of spectators finding their seats. Each sound was part of the symphony of justice she had grown to love. Judge Wilson adjusted her robe one final time and checked her appearance in the small mirror on her wall. Her hair was neatly styled, her expression composed and professional. She touched the small pin on her lapel, a gift from her mother when she passed the bar exam. It was a simple golden scale of justice, a reminder of the responsibility she carried. "Time, Your Honor," Sarah announced softly. Judge Wilson gathered her files and took a deep breath. As she prepared to enter her courtroom, she had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday would become one of the most significant days in her career. A day that would test not just her judicial authority, but her personal courage and dedication to justice. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Karen Wilson presiding." As she took her seat at the bench, Judge Wilson looked out over her courtroom with the same sense of purpose she felt on her very first day. Little did she know, in just a few hours, this same courtroom would become the stage for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the justice system and force America to face some uncomfortable truths about racism in law enforcement. The morning session had proceeded smoothly until 10 a.m., when Marcus Thompson's traffic violation case was called. The young man, dressed in a borrowed suit that was slightly too big for his lean frame, approached the defendant's table. At 21, he was a junior at Detroit State University, studying engineering on a scholarship. Officer James Harrison strode into the courtroom with an air of arrogance that immediately changed the atmosphere. He was tall, with graying hair at his temples and a physique that suggested he still maintained the same workout routine from his military days. His police uniform was pressed to perfection, every badge and button gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Judge Wilson noticed how Harrison barely acknowledged her presence on the bench, a subtle but clear sign of disrespect. When he walked past Marcus Thompson, he made a point of adjusting his gun holster, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed by those in the courtroom. Case number 2023 CR 405, People vs. Marcus Thompson, Sarah Martinez announced, her voice steady and professional. Judge Wilson began the proceedings by asking Marcus to explain his version of events. The young man stood, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Your Honor, Marcus began, I was driving home from my late-night study group at the library. I know for certain that the light was yellow when I went through the intersection. Officer Harrison pulled me over, but before I could even explain. Objection. Harrison interrupted loudly, not following proper courtroom protocol. This kid is lying through his teeth. Judge Wilson's gavel came down sharply. Officer Harrison, you will wait your turn to speak, and you will address this court with proper respect. Continue, Mr. Thompson. Marcus described how Harrison had immediately ordered him out of the car, made him stand in the cold for 20 minutes, and searched his vehicle without consent. The officer had found nothing but textbooks and a gym bag. When it was Harrison's turn to testify, he swaggered to the witness stand. Rather than sitting immediately, he stood for a moment, looking down at Judge Wilson with barely concealed disdain. Officer Harrison, please be seated and state your version of events, Judge Wilson instructed, maintaining her professional demeanor. Harrison sat but didn't lose his aggressive posture. The perp ran a red light, clear as day. When I pulled him over, he was argumentative and showed signs of potentially being armed. And what signs were those, Officer Harrison? Judge Wilson asked, reviewing the incident report in front of her. I know these types, Harrison replied dismissively. You can tell just by looking. These types? Judge Wilson interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. Please clarify what you mean by that statement, officer. The tension in the courtroom grew thick. Several attorneys who had stayed to watch their next cases exchanged knowing glances. Sarah Martinez's pen stopped moving across her notepad as she looked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Harrison's face reddened. I mean criminals, Your Honor, he said, but his tone made it clear he meant something else entirely. Judge Wilson leaned forward slightly. Officer Harrison, I have your traffic stop statistics for the past year in front of me. Would you care to explain why 80% of your stops involve African American drivers in an area where they make up only 25% of the population? With all due respect, Your Honor, Harrison spat the words out, making them sound anything but respectful. I don't need some quota-hired judge questioning my methods. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson's expression remained unchanged, but her voice carried the weight of steel when she spoke. Officer Harrison, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. I suggest you remember where you are and who you're addressing. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I know exactly who I'm addressing, he growled, taking a step toward the bench. And I'm not about to let my reputation be questioned by. Officer Harrison, Judge Wilson cut him off. You will return to your seat immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. The bailiff took a step forward, but Harrison ignored him. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and a vein pulsed visibly in his neck. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression appear even more menacing. The entire courtroom held its breath, watching as 15 years of unchecked authority and racial bias collided with the immovable force of judicial power. No one could have predicted what would happen next, but everyone present could feel that something was about to break. The tension in courtroom 304 had reached a breaking point. Officer Harrison stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, while Judge Wilson maintained her composed posture behind the bench. The morning sun that had earlier filled the room with warm light now felt harsh and exposing. Officer Harrison, Judge Wilson began, her voice steady and clear. I am going to ask you a series of questions about your traffic stop of Mr. Thompson. You'll answer them truthfully and professionally. Do you understand? Harrison's jaw tightened visibly. Yes, he replied, deliberately omitting the customary Your Honor. Judge Wilson opened a folder on her desk. According to your report, you observed Mr. Thompson's vehicle run a red light at 11:42 p.m. However, the traffic camera footage from that intersection shows his car passing through on a yellow light at 11:39 p.m. How do you explain this discrepancy? The color drained from Harrison's face, replaced by a mottled red that crept up his neck. He hadn't expected there to be camera footage. Those cameras malfunction all the time, he shot back. My word as an officer should be enough. Your word as an officer, Judge Wilson repeated carefully, is being called into question by concrete evidence. Would you like to revise your statement? The gallery had grown so quiet that the software of the courtroom's air conditioning seemed thunderous. Sarah Martinez's pen hovered over her notepad, frozen in anticipation. Even Marcus Thompson, who had been nervously fidgeting throughout the proceedings, sat perfectly still. Harrison took another step forward. The bailiff moved closer, sensing the escalating situation. I've been on the force for 15 years, Harrison snarled. I dealt with their kind every day. I know what I saw. Their kind? Officer Harrison? Judge Wilson's voice carried a sharp edge. This is the second time you've used discriminatory language in my courtroom. I'm warning you. Warning me? Harrison barked out a harsh laugh. You people always stick together, don't you? A black judge defending a black criminal. This is why the system's broken. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Several attorneys reached for their phones, recognizing the historical significance of what was unfolding. The bailiff's hand moved to his weapon, but Judge Wilson raised her hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Officer Harrison, you are now in contempt of court, she declared. Furthermore, I am recommending an immediate investigation into all your traffic stops from the past 5 years. Bailiff, please. You don't have the right, Harrison shouted, his face contorted with rage. You sit up there in your fancy robe, pretending you're better than me. I've kept these streets safe while you've been coddling criminals. Judge Wilson remained unflinching. Officer Harrison, you will step back and allow the bailiff to escort you out, or what? Harrison's voice had dropped to a dangerous growl. You'll call more of your people to protect you. I've watched this country go to hell because of judges like you, letting thugs walk free, disrespecting real law enforcement. The racial undertones in Harrison's words had become explicit threats. Judge Wilson pressed the silent alarm button under her bench, but she knew help would take precious minutes to arrive. Still, she refused to show fear. For the record, she stated clearly, making sure the court reporter captured every word, Officer James Harrison is exhibiting clear racial bias and threatening behavior toward this court. His actions today will be reported to. Report this. Harrison lunged forward, his movement so sudden that even the bailiff was caught off guard. His face was inches from the bench now, spittle flying as he shouted, You think that robe protects you? You think you're untouchable up there? The courtroom erupted into chaos. Sarah Martinez jumped from her seat, files scattering across the floor. Marcus Thompson stood up, instinctively wanting to help but frozen in place by years of being taught to fear police officers. The bailiff was moving forward, but he was on the wrong side of the bench to reach Harrison quickly. Judge Wilson remained seated, her back straight, her eyes locked with Harrison's. In them, she saw years of unchecked power, of implicit bias turned to explicit hatred, of a system that had allowed men like him to act with impunity. But in her own reflection in his rage-filled eyes, she saw something else, the strength of every barrier she had broken, every obstacle she had overcome, and every principle of justice she had sworn to uphold. No one in the courtroom could have predicted what would happen next, but everyone present would remember it for the rest of their lives. The next hour in the courthouse moved at a whirlwind pace. Judge Wilson sat in her chambers, holding an ice pack to her cheek while a police photographer documented her injury. The mark had darkened to an angry red, with hints of purple beginning to show around the edges. Detective Sarah Chen from Internal Affairs had arrived within minutes of the incident. She sat across from Judge Wilson's desk, her notebook open as she recorded every detail of the assault. The detective's face remained professional, but her eyes betrayed her anger at a fellow officer's actions. Judge Wilson, Detective Chen said, I need to ask. Did Officer Harrison show any signs of aggressive behavior before today? Judge Wilson lowered the ice pack and straightened in her chair. His entire demeanor from the moment he entered my courtroom was hostile, but the real evidence is in his record. I want a full investigation into every traffic stop, every arrest, every complaint filed against him. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Martinez entered, holding her tablet. Your Honor, you need to see this. She turned the screen toward them. The incident had already gone viral. Cell phone footage from multiple angles showed Harrison's attack and Judge Wilson's composed response. The media is outside, Sarah added. Every major network wants a statement. And, she hesitated, the mayor and police commissioner are on their way. Judge Wilson nodded, unsurprised. Sarah, please call my sister Patricia. Tell her to bring my spare suit from home. She turned to Detective Chen. I want to make something clear. This isn't just about me being assaulted. This is about every person Officer Harrison has ever stopped, arrested, or intimidated because of their race. Detective Chen nodded, understanding the larger implications. We'll pull everything. Body cam footage, dash cam videos, complaint records, even the ones that were dismissed. Another knock, more urgent this time. The courthouse's head of security entered, looking grave. Judge Wilson, we finished our preliminary review of the security footage. There's something you should know. Just before entering your courtroom, Harrison made several calls. We believe he was tipped off about the traffic camera footage you had accessed. The revelation hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about one racist officer losing control. There was a broader network at play. Judge Wilson stood, removing her judicial robe. The simple act seemed to transform her from a judge into a warrior preparing for battle. Detective Chen, I want every officer who had contact with Harrison this morning interviewed. Sarah, prepare a statement for the press. We're not hiding from this. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus Thompson, the young student whose case had triggered the incident. Judge Wilson, my classmates and I are organizing a peaceful demonstration outside the courthouse. We stand with you. She smiled slightly, despite the pain in her cheek. The system might be broken, but the next generation was ready to help fix it. The door opened again, and her sister Patricia rushed in, carrying the garment bag. One look at Judge Wilson's face, and tears welled up in her eyes. Karen. I'm okay, Pat, Judge Wilson assured her, accepting a brief hug. But we have work to do. As she changed into the fresh suit, Judge Wilson could hear the growing crowd outside the courthouse. News helicopters buzzed overhead, and chants for justice echoed against the building's stone walls. When she emerged from her private bathroom, everyone in her chambers noticed the transformation. Gone was any trace of a victim. In her place stood a woman ready to turn this assault into a catalyst for change. Detective Chen, I want hourly updates on the investigation, she instructed. Sarah, arrange a press conference for 2 p.m. Pat, call Mom's old civil rights contacts. We're going to need their expertise. Before leaving her chambers, Judge Wilson paused at the mirror. The bruise on her face was now clearly visible, but she made no attempt to cover it. Let them see, she thought. Let them see what happens when power goes unchecked, when bias wears a badge, when justice must fight back. As she opened her chamber doors to face the media storm waiting outside, Judge Wilson remembered something her mother used to say. Sometimes the best response to hatred is to shine so bright they can't ignore the light. The next few hours would prove crucial, not just for her case against Harrison, but for the larger fight against systemic racism in law enforcement. Judge Wilson adjusted her suit jacket, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. The real battle was just beginning. The police department's interrogation room had never felt smaller than it did that afternoon. Officer James Harrison sat handcuffed to the table, his police uniform replaced by an orange jumpsuit. His earlier bravado had crumbled, leaving behind a man who finally realized the magnitude of his actions. Across from him, internal affairs investigators had spread out dozens of files, years of complaints, suspicious traffic stops, and incidents that had been quietly buried by sympathetic supervisors. The evidence mounted hour by hour as more officers came forward, breaking the blue wall of silence. Officer Harrison, Detective Chen began, her voice cool and professional. We've reviewed your body camera footage from the past 3 years. Would you like to explain why it was conveniently turned off during 47 traffic stops involving minority drivers? Harrison stared at his hands, silent. His police union lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him. The evidence was damning, and they both knew it. Meanwhile, in the district attorney's office, a different scene was unfolding. Judge Wilson sat across from District Attorney Michael Reynolds, her bruised face now a stark symbol of the day's events. The photos of her injury had already become front-page news across the country. "We're charging him with felony assault on a federal judge, civil rights violations, and criminal contempt of court," Reynolds explained, sliding the charging documents across his desk. "The FBI is also opening a separate investigation into his past conduct." Judge Wilson reviewed the papers carefully. "And his collaborators?" she asked, looking up. "The officers who warned him about the traffic camera footage?" Reynolds nodded grimly. "3 officers have already been suspended. We're looking at conspiracy charges." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to thousands. Marcus Thompson had organized a peaceful protest that attracted students, civil rights activists, and concerned citizens. They carried signs reading "Justice for Judge Wilson" and "No badge for bigotry." Local news crews captured the moment when several veteran police officers joined the protest, their presence sending a powerful message about choosing right over brotherhood. The old guard was being challenged by those within its own ranks. Back at the courthouse, Sarah Martinez was coordinating with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They had set up a hotline for people to report past encounters with Officer Harrison, and the phones hadn't stopped ringing. "We're up to 200 complaints," she reported to Judge Wilson, who had returned to her chambers. "People who were afraid to speak up before are coming forward. Some of the stories—" She paused, shaking her head. Judge Wilson's phone buzzed with a text from her son. "Mom, you're trending nationwide. You're showing everyone what strength looks like." The afternoon brought a press conference on the courthouse steps. Judge Wilson stood at the podium, her bruise visible to the cameras, but her voice unwavering. "Today's incident is not about one judge or one officer," she began. "It's about a system that has allowed bias and brutality to hide behind a badge. That ends now." The crowd erupted in applause as she continued. "I am announcing the formation of a civilian oversight committee to review all police conduct in our district. We will examine every complaint, every arrest, every interaction. No one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it." In the county jail, Harrison watched the press conference on a small TV in his cell. The reality of his situation was sinking in. His career was over, his pension gone, and he was facing years in federal prison. But more than that, he had become the face of everything wrong with the system he had sworn to serve. By evening, the story had gone international. News outlets from around the world were covering the judge who stood up to systemic racism in law enforcement. Legal experts appeared on TV panels, discussing the broader implications of the case. In her chambers, Judge Wilson finally allowed herself a moment of reflection. She touched the bruise on her face gently, remembering her father's words about sending the elevator back down. Today, she hadn't just sent it down, she had torn down the walls around it. Her phone rang. It was the Attorney General of the United States. "Judge Wilson," he said, "we'd like you to head a national task force on police reform. Your experience and courage make you the perfect choice." As she considered the offer, Judge Wilson looked out her window at the protesters still gathered below, their candles creating a sea of light in the growing darkness. Change was coming, and she would be at the forefront of it. The next day's headline in the Detroit Free Press would read, "Judges Stand Against Police Brutality Sparks National Movement for Reform." But the real story was just beginning to unfold. One morning, as Judge Wilson prepared for another day in court, Sarah Martinez brought in the latest statistics. "The numbers are remarkable, Your Honor," she said, spreading the papers across the desk. "Complaints against officers are down 60%. Every traffic stop is now recorded and reviewed. Officers with multiple bias complaints are being retrained or removed." But the most significant change came from within the police force itself. Veteran officers were stepping forward, breaking years of silence about witness misconduct. The blue wall was crumbling, brick by brick. Marcus Thompson, the student whose traffic stop had triggered the incident, had become an unlikely leader in the reform movement. He started a program called Bridge the Badge, bringing together police officers and minority students for monthly dialogue sessions. It's changing minds on both sides, he told Judge Wilson during the community meeting. Officers are seeing us as people, not statistics, and we're seeing them as humans, not just uniforms. The national task force that Judge Wilson now led had implemented a groundbreaking transparency-first policy. Every police department in the country was required to publish their arrest statistics, broken down by race and reason for arrest. The data painted a stark picture that could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, Judge Wilson received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. It was Officer Harrison's wife, Lisa. "I wanted you to know," Lisa said, her voice trembling, "that James was wrong. He's been wrong for years, and I never spoke up. His anger, his prejudice. I watched it grow and said nothing. I'm part of the problem too." Judge Wilson listened as Lisa shared stories of how her husband had changed over the years, how the job had hardened him, how casual racism had turned into something darker. It was a pattern they were now seeing repeated across departments nationwide. The task force's work revealed something crucial. The problem wasn't just about individual racist officers, but about a system that protected them. Judge Wilson's attack had exposed not just one man's bigotry, but an entire network of enablers. The reforms weren't easy. There was pushback from police unions, threats from those who benefited from the old system, and resistance from officers who feared change. But the movement had gained too much momentum to be stopped. New training programs were implemented nationwide. Instead of just focusing on weapons and tactics, officers now spent significant time studying civil rights history, implicit bias, and community relations. Body cameras became mandatory, with automatic notifications if they were turned off during any interaction. Judge Wilson's bruise had long since healed, but the image of her standing strong after the assault had become a symbol of resistance against injustice. Young law students, especially women of color, cited her as their inspiration for pursuing legal careers. The changes reached beyond police reform. Courts began examining their own biases in sentencing. Prosecutors started reviewing old cases where police testimony might have been tainted by prejudice. Public defenders received more funding and resources. One day, as Judge Wilson left the courthouse, she noticed something different. The tension that had always existed between police officers and citizens, especially in minority neighborhoods, had begun to ease. Officers were out of their cars, talking to community members, learning names and stories. At a national conference on police reform, Judge Wilson delivered a keynote speech that would be remembered for years to come. "The day I was struck in my courtroom could have been just another statistic, another incident swept under the rug. Instead, it became a turning point. Not because of what happened to me, but because thousands of people finally said enough. Change doesn't come from one person or one moment. It comes when we all stand together and demand better." The conference room erupted in applause, but Judge Wilson wasn't finished. "This isn't just about police reform. It's about creating a justice system that truly serves justice. It's about building a world where no one fears those sworn to protect them, where the law treats everyone equally, and where the color of your skin doesn't determine your fate in a traffic stop." As she finished speaking, Judge Wilson could see her father's words coming true. She hadn't just sent the elevator back down. She had built a new one, bigger and stronger, that could carry more people toward justice. The work wasn't finished, but the path forward was clear. The system was changing, one department, one officer, one interaction at a time. The president was about to sign the Wilson Act, comprehensive legislation that would transform law enforcement across the nation. The act, largely shaped by Judge Wilson's task force recommendations, would create mandatory accountability measures, reform police training, and establish civilian oversight boards in every jurisdiction. As she looked out at the crowd, Judge Wilson reflected on the past year's achievements. Officer Harrison had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, but more importantly, his case had exposed a network of systemic racism that could no longer be ignored. 27 officers had been dismissed from the Detroit Police Department alone, and hundreds more nationwide had faced disciplinary action. "The change we've seen," Judge Wilson began her speech, "isn't just about numbers and statistics. It's about human dignity. It's about trust restored. It's about justice that truly serves all people." In the audience, she spotted Lisa Harrison, who had become an unlikely ally in the reform movement. After her husband's conviction, Lisa had started a support group for police families dealing with trauma and bias, helping to break the cycle of hatred before it could take root. The most significant change had come from within police departments themselves. The thin blue line had been redrawn, not as a barrier between police and community, but as a bridge connecting them. New officers were being trained by community members alongside veteran cops, learning the neighborhood's history, culture, and concerns firsthand. Marcus Thompson's Bridge the Badge program had gone national, with chapters in every major city. Young people who once feared the police were now considering careers in law enforcement, seeing it as a way to protect and serve their own communities. Judge Wilson continued her speech. A year ago, when Officer Harrison struck me in my courtroom, he thought he was striking down just one judge. Instead, he awakened a nation to the reality of systemic racism in law enforcement. Today, we don't just condemn one man's actions, we transform an entire system. The statistics told a powerful story. Use of force incidents had dropped by 70% in departments that implemented the new reforms. Civilian complaints were down, while community trust ratings had soared. More importantly, both officers and citizens reported feeling safer and more respected. After the ceremony, Judge Wilson met privately with a group of police cadets from Detroit's new training program. Among them was Marcus Thompson's younger brother, who had decided to become an officer to be part of the change. "Your Honor," he said, "when my brother was pulled over that day, I never imagined it would lead to this. You showed us that the system can change when good people stand up." Later that evening, back in her chambers in Detroit, Judge Wilson received a letter. It was from Officer Harrison, written from prison. "I was wrong," he wrote. "Not just about that day, but about everything. I let hatred blind me to my duty and my humanity. Your strength in standing up to me has forced me to face my own weakness." As she prepared to leave for the day, Sarah Martinez brought in one final report. The national database they had created showed a dramatic shift in police interactions across the country. Traffic stops, arrests, and use of force incidents now reflected population demographics rather than racial bias. "We did it," Sarah said simply, tears in her eyes. Judge Wilson smiled, touching the spot on her cheek where the bruise had once been. "No, Sarah, we're still doing it. This is just the beginning." Outside the courthouse, the evening sun cast long shadows across the steps where protesters had once gathered. Now, those same steps hosted community meetings between officers and residents, working together to build trust and understanding. Judge Wilson paused at the top of the steps, remembering her father's words about sending the elevator back down. She had done more than that. She had helped build a new foundation for justice itself. As she walked to her car, she passed a young police officer talking and laughing with a group of teenagers. The officer caught her eye and saluted, not out of fear or obligation, but with genuine respect. The headline in next morning's paper would read, "Wilson Act signed. A new era in American justice begins." But for Judge Karen Wilson, it wasn't about headlines or legacy. It was about making sure that every person, regardless of their race, could trust in the promise of equal justice under law. The bruise had faded, but the change it inspired would last for generations to come. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Harrison's hand rose in the air. The fluorescent lights caught the glint of his wedding ring as his palm swung toward Judge Wilson's face. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Wilson's head snapped to the side from the force of the slap, her reading glasses clattering to the floor. For a split second, the entire courtroom froze in shocked silence. Then chaos erupted. "Call security," Sarah Martinez screamed, already reaching for the phone. The bailiff finally reached Harrison, attempting to grab him from behind, but the officer's military training showed as he easily broke free. His face was contorted with a mixture of rage and something else, the sudden realization of what he had just done. But before anyone could react further, Judge Wilson slowly turned her head back to face Harrison. A red mark was forming on her left cheek, but her eyes blazed with a fire that made even Harrison take a step back. She reached down and pressed a button on her bench. "Security to courtroom 304, her voice rang out clear and steady over the courthouse intercom system. "Code black. I repeat, code black." Harrison seemed to recover from his momentary shock. "What are you going to do now, Your Honor?" He sneered, though his voice wavered slightly. "Hide behind your badges." Judge Wilson stood up, her full height impressive even without the elevated bench. "Officer James Harrison," she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of the law itself, "you are under arrest for assault on a federal judge, contempt of court, and civil rights violations." The doors of the courtroom burst open as 6 security officers rushed in, weapons drawn. Harrison spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "I wouldn't." Judge Wilson's voice cut through the tension. "Add assaulting federal officers to your charges, and you'll never see the outside of a prison cell again." Harrison's hand froze. The security team surrounded him, 2 officers quickly moving to secure his weapon while others handcuffed him. The metallic click of the handcuffs seemed to echo in the now silent courtroom. As they began to lead Harrison away, Judge Wilson's voice stopped them. "Wait." She stepped down from the bench, her robe flowing around her as she walked with deliberate steps toward Harrison. The security team parted slightly, though keeping a firm grip on their prisoner. Standing directly in front of Harrison, Judge Wilson reached up and removed his police badge from his uniform. The small piece of metal caught the light as she held it up. "This badge represents honor, duty, and protection of all citizens. You have disgraced everything it stands for." Harrison's face had lost all color. The reality of his actions was finally setting in, along with the understanding that his career, his freedom, and his life as he knew it had just ended. All because he couldn't control his hatred and bias. "Take him to holding," Judge Wilson ordered. "I want him processed immediately." As Harrison was led away, the courtroom remained silent. Judge Wilson turned to face the gallery, where phones were already out, recording the aftermath of what had just occurred. She knew this incident would be viral within hours, another example of the deep-rooted problems within the system. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," she announced, her voice never wavering. "Mr. Thompson, your case is dismissed with prejudice. The court apologizes for your experience with Officer Harrison." Marcus Thompson stood, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor," he managed to say. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many still in shock, Sarah Martinez approached the bench with a first aid kit. "Your Honor, should I call for medical assistance?" Judge Wilson touched her cheek, which was now clearly showing the red imprint of Harrison's hand. "No, Sarah, but I will need you to document everything. Take photographs of the injury and prepare an incident report. We're going to handle this by the book." She picked up her fallen glasses, surprisingly unbroken, and placed them back on her face. The courtroom was almost empty now, but she remained standing, straight and dignified. In the reflection of the window, she could see her father's words playing out, about standing up, fighting back the right way, about using the system to change the system. The morning sun still streamed through the high windows of courtroom 304, but now it illuminated something different, not just a judge, but a symbol of resistance against injustice, standing tall despite being struck down. The real fight, Judge Wilson knew, was just beginning.